Today's podcast is presented by Podgo. Podgo is the easiest way for you to monetize your podcast, providing podcasters with a flat rate for ad space so you always know how much you get when you include an ad from Podgo. I recently joined as a member, and you can too. Apply today to become a member and immediately be connected with advertisers that fit your audience. Apply now at podgo.co, that is podgo.co. Again, podgo.co. And if you're feeling generous, when you get to the How Did You Hear About Podgo section of the application, you could put down Quick News Daily so they know who sent you. Alright, let's get on with the show. Hello again, everyone. Once again coming off the long weekend. Today is Monday, December 7th, and this wouldn't be a news show unless I played the most cliché soundbite that every show plays on this date.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Yes, it has been 79 years since the attack on Pearl Harbor, and I actually forget how many people died. 2,335 servicemen plus 68 civilians. There were also 1,143 service members and 35 civilians wounded, with 3 civilian aircraft being shot down. I honestly don't know which one would be worse. The people caught on the sinking battleships, or even worse, trapped inside for hours as they slowly sunk, or to be some random dude out for a Sunday morning flight with my new plane, and then out of nowhere, here comes the Japanese army shooting at me. I choose neither. Certainly, our thoughts go out to any family members still affected by this, so many years later. As for the rest of our show, it's certainly a more internationally focused show than usual, with stops in France and South Korea. Let's get right to it and get caught up. In fact, we'll start in France, where they've had some pretty substantial protests these past 2 weeks. This article says, quote, "Hooded anarchists launched projectiles at riot police, smashed up shop fronts, torched cars and burned barricades during a demonstration in the French capital on Saturday night against police violence and a draft security law." End quote. The police then took those as invitations to launch tear gas and charge at the protesters, I'm sure with clubs and riot shields or something of that sort. Other protests took place in Marseille and other French cities, but they're not Paris, so our American news services don't really ask for details on those. The official story for the Paris demonstrations is that they started peacefully with folks waving banners that said things like, "France, land of police rights," and "withdrawal of the security law." Then, police said 500 hoodlums or rioters, depending on the translation, joined in on the protests, which is when the violence, quote-unquote, big air quotes there, started happening. In the end, 30 people had been arrested by the end of the day. So what's the reason for these protests? One is that the president, Emmanuel Macron, is advocating a new bill that wants to increase surveillance tools and restrict sharing of images of police officers in the media and online. Boy, doesn't that sound like a fun little mix? The police can watch you and do who knows what with your personal information, maybe even your picture, but you can't share pictures of the police. Aw, are the widowed police officers scared of consequences for their actions? And it's not like the protesters are just protesting something theoretical. As recently as the end of November, video footage came out of the police beating up music producer Michael Zechler, who is black. I'm honestly pretty disappointed by Macron here. I was really hopeful for him since he won with like 66% of the vote. But I guess maybe because he was going against a right-wing crazy, he got that much. Although if that happened in America, the right-wing crazy would have won. I also read this really interesting article from a journalist who followed him throughout the campaign and in the early days of his presidency, and there was this awesome behind-the-scenes documentary about his campaign, and Macron really seemed like a great new leader, like a new style of leader. That's why it's just so disappointing to see him make this turn. There was one thing that I never understood. Just a few weeks after Macron took office, his approval rating was like in the high 20s or mid-30s, somewhere in there. And they're not like us in France, they're smart. They only have a week or two from the election until the new guy takes office. Or woman. So he just immediately went down like 40 points? What's up with that? French listeners, you gotta help me out here. Back to this bill though. Apparently he's already gearing up for the 2022 election, so this bill is part of his pitch to seem like a tough law and order guy. Thanks, Richard Nixon. He's not totally oblivious, though, because after Macron saw that these protests were ramping up, he said on Friday that, of course, people of color are more likely to be stopped by police for ID checks than their white, fellow citizens. And he promised the creation of an online platform for people to log unwarranted searches. However, the police saw this for what it probably was, a political flip-flop. So the police unions got all up in a huff about that and said Macron's comments were shameful, and they also denied that they are racist. You're always in the winning position if you have to say, "We're not racist, we promise." One of the police unions also threatened to halt random checks at the border that are designed to stop people from going to Swiss and Spanish ski resorts, which are hotspots for COVID infections. Maybe a French listener, again, can explain this better, but this seems like a weird threat to me. Like, yeah, we beat up people that we stop on the streets, and of course we're going to randomly stop all the minorities and none of the white people. So, of course things are going to end up badly. So you know what? We won't do them. Honestly, it sounds like they're accidentally stumbling into the right answer. But realistically, making both the people and the police mad is pretty dangerous. And I would be nervous if I were Macron. I hope he treads carefully and ends up redeeming himself here. Let's keep that international theme rolling and check in with South Korea, where they're seeing their COVID infections reach a 9-month high. To me, this story is actually less about South Korea and more about how bad our country's response has been. In their country, they're imposing restrictions for 3 weeks. These restrictions include a curfew for businesses, cutting down public transportation, which is mainly how people get around, banning gatherings of more than 50 people, closing gyms and karaoke bars, requiring religious services to be online, and stricter attendance rules for schools. Dining in at restaurants will still be allowed, but the government is urging people to avoid it if possible. I think the craziest thing is that these new rules are because they had 631 new cases on Saturday, which was their highest since the early days like February or March. In the entire country, 631. Their total numbers for the entire pandemic are 37,546 cases and 545 deaths. That is incredible. And the thing about these new restrictions is that they mean that they were allowed to do these things until now. Like all this gathering and stuff. They were living normally. Just to be clear, yes, they are a smaller country than us, but check this out. Their population is about 51 million people, so 631 new cases means that about 0.001% of the population tested positive for the day on Saturday. And that's what spooked them. That's what got them nervous. The US, on the other hand, averages about 100,000 cases a day now, and we have a population of about 330 million. That means that each day, 0.03% of our tests come back positive. If you're following along at home with your calculator, that means that our positive test percentage per day is about 30 times their positive percentage. And here, like half the country or more is just living life like they normally do, without a care in the world. I guess that's why South Korea has lost 545 citizens, and we've just crossed 282,000 deaths in the US.
Never gonna be president now. Never gonna be president now. One less thing to worry about. That's one less thing to worry about.
I decided over the weekend that Trump is not really relevant anymore, so that music will be my transition music to let you know we've entered the segment about Trump on the show.
Never gonna be president now.
He is still the president for a little over a month, meaning he's still technically important. And don't get me wrong, he can mess up a lot of stuff. But at this point, this is pretty much just going to be for comedy. Over the weekend, Forbes had some good reporting about Trump's relationship with Twitter. First, there was a story pointing out that Trump's Twitter has been losing followers at a pretty decent pace. He reached his peak number of followers on November 17th, with his follower count at almost 89 million. Every day since then, he's had a net loss of followers. Before this, he never had a net loss for more than 2 consecutive days. In total, he's down about 220,000 followers from that peak. That's still way more than he should have, but it's progress. Maybe that's just the first wave of Russian bots to shut down their accounts? Who knows? Forbes also pointed out that in the past 2 weeks, Trump hasn't tweeted anything about the coronavirus, but he has tweeted about election fraud 97 times. 97 times! What a narcissistic psychopath. They also calculated that in the 2 days after the election, Twitter labeled 50% of his tweets with all sorts of warnings about the tweet containing misinformation. He's literally just like your regular crazy family member on Facebook, except he's in the most powerful job in the world. However, after noon on January 20th, he won't be in that job, meaning he won't qualify for Twitter's dumbass world leaders policy, which is just a stupid policy that they have where they've said that they won't take down a tweet that breaks their rules if a world leader is the one that posts it because most people want to see what their leader is saying. That's maybe the dumbest thing I've ever heard. I'm sure several Democratic politicians or celebrities have been super close to being hurt by one of his crazy followers because he's attacked them on Twitter. I mean, that guy who mailed the bombs back in 2018 mailed them to pretty much everyone Trump attacked on his Twitter feed. I mean, just personally, I truly believe that back when Trump and Kim Jong-un were tweeting back and forth about the size of their their nuclear launch buttons, Twitter would have let them start a nuclear war just because they didn't want to delete a tweet that would get pretty much any one of us arrested. But anyways, since Trump won't be the world leader after January 20th, Twitter confirmed that he'll have to follow the same rules as all of us. There aren't any set rules for punishment, but it usually goes Twitter blocking your account until you delete the tweet for your first offense, temporarily freezing your account for the second offense, and then yada yada yada, eventually they delete your account. I don't think it's much of a secret that they don't like Trump at Twitter, but the cynical part of me says that they probably never had more free advertising than they have since he started his campaign in 2015. I'll believe it when I see it, but the sweet, sweet prospect of Trump getting banned is something I'll be fantasizing about. Forbes said that Twitter wouldn't discuss if they've had internal discussions about what they do if they reach the point where they have to ban him, which means that they've definitely had internal discussions about what they do if they had to ban him. We'll just have to see if they rise to the occasion. What we can't let the media do is follow Trump to whatever platform he goes to next. I doubt Mark Zuckerberg will ever ban him from Facebook, and God knows that QAnon Crazy Town Parler never will, so the media really has to calm itself down and refuse to follow his accounts there if he gets banned from Twitter. The last bit of news here is that, speaking of Twitter, Trump announced in a tweet that Rudy Giuliani has COVID, and sources say that he was admitted to Georgetown University Hospital on Sunday. The worst part of the news is that he spent all week zigzagging the country trying to get states to ignore the Constitution and declare Trump the winner in that state just because, meaning he was probably COVID positive at some point and spreading it everywhere he went during that time. Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Alright folks, that'll do it for this Monday episode. Thank you to everyone who read and or shared my latest story from Medium comparing the current GOP to the rise of the Nazi Party. I am making that available on the regular website with no paywall, so if you haven't had a chance to read the story yet, you can visit quicknewsdaily.com to do so right now. I do want to give a heads up that I will most likely be skipping a show on Wednesday or Thursday this week because Thursday is looking pretty busy. So I don't know yet if I want to get a show out on Wednesday and then do my work after, or if I want to do everything on Wednesday and then only do a show on Thursday. In any case, just don't be surprised if you don't see a new episode on one of those days. And in general, I would ask for your patience with me over the next 2 weeks because it's the end of the semester up here. It always gets a little crazy. In other quick news, it is Monday, so let's take some time to acknowledge our contributors, producer Kathy and executive producer Gwen. Thank you so much for your support, both of you, and to all of the listeners out there. Any support means just the world to this show. With that in mind, I also want to thank our sources for today's show. The stories about France and South Korea came from Reuters, and the Twitter stories came from Jack Brewster and Tommy Beer from Forbes. Alright everyone, that is the lay of the land. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you back here tomorrow. Today is Tuesday, December 8th. Thanks for choosing Quick News Daily. For our stories today, they may seem like they're all local stories, or stories that only affect a certain community or city or state, but what I try to do on the show is explain how everything is connected. We really do have an impact on people everywhere around the world. It's just so interconnected now because of the internet and transportation being easier, well, in a non-COVID world. So I think it's crucial to try and cover stories from almost anywhere. And I'll try to show you what I mean by that today. Without further ado, let's get caught up. Let's start with a scary situation that went down in Florida yesterday. That was all because of a small, weak, pathetic governor. Maybe. For all of you Florida listeners, I'm sure it's no secret down there that Governor Ron DeSantis, whose face just says, "My wife doesn't love me," has handled the coronavirus absolutely terribly. He tried to deny it and keep everything open for as long as he could, and because he went full Trump, many people died that didn't need to die. I mean, he did this knowing that he's the governor of the retirement capital of the US. Based on that, I'm sure it won't surprise you if I tell you that he hasn't exactly been transparent with reporting the COVID stats in his state. In fact, he was so misleading that, thankfully, the Geographic Information System Manager for the Florida Department of Health spoke out, but got fired for it. Since that time, this employee, named Rebekah Jones, decided to create her own website that reports information about Florida's COVID numbers, including the numbers for hospital bed availability for specific facilities and nationwide COVID cases by school, which DeSantis did not allow to be released publicly at all, or at least until he absolutely had to. Well, yesterday morning, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement raided her house at 8:30 a.m. with guns drawn because they said that Jones hacked into the state email system and sent a message to other government employees, which isn't allowed because that system is supposed to be for emergencies only, or so the law enforcement says. They say that they entered the home so forcefully because Jones wasn't opening the door and hung up on an agent who tried to call. But Jones says that she was taking her time opening the door because she was getting dressed, since she thought she was being arrested. It's not confirmed that this raid was ordered by DeSantis himself, but it does seem pretty suspicious that these officers on this raid were so heavily armed for a data breach, big air quotes around that was really just an email telling other employees to not be afraid to speak out. Jones denies that she even wrote the email, and I think that she's hinting at this email being part of a plot to frame her and silence her for reporting these numbers. I think the most unforgivable part of this is that these thugs came in and pointed guns at her and her kids, including her 2-year-old. What does that accomplish? Is the baby really a threat? Jones thinks that this wasn't really about the email, and that it was more to scare her into silence and stopping her work on the COVID website. I think that certainly makes sense. She also thinks it's funny that she's being accused of being a hacker because, quote, DeSantis publicly said I'm not a data scientist, I'm not a computer scientist, and I wouldn't even know what to do if I saw a database, end quote. He said that back in May after she was first fired. That's the sort of two-faced attack that Trump uses. It's like when he said that John Bolton's book was nothing but a bunch of lies, but at the exact same time, he was suing Bolton for revealing classified national security information in the book. How can it be lies, but also contain this super secret national security info? The bunch of lies attack is just for Fox News to play clips of on their shows, and the national security accusation is for the courts. I think my favorite quote of hers is when she said, quote, I'm not a hacker, I don't hack, I don't know bleep about computers, I know how to do statistics. I think I'm going to put that on my resume, actually. She also said, quote, I'm going to buy another computer tomorrow and go back to work, end quote. So good for her for still being that determined. Let's actually listen to a bit of her on Cuomo Primetime last night.
DeSantis needs to worry less about what I'm writing about and more about the people who are sick and dying in his state. And doing this to me will not stop me from reporting the data.
Isn't that kind of metal as far as politics stuff goes? All in all, I'm not quite sure what to think on this one. I think maybe two things could be true at once. This raid could be a show of force by DeSantis to silence her and or frame her. And maybe she's not being completely truthful either. I think it is too early to judge, but her story of not coming to the door seems just a little bit weak. The email also sounds like it would have been written by her, but she says the stats in the email are wrong and still lower than what they actually were, which could point to the framing theory. I just can't get over the gun in the 2-year-old's face. That says to me that they were really trying to intimidate her, and it's not so much about the hack itself. I think it's too early to tell on this one, but Ron DeSantis is on thin ice here, and it should freak everyone out that this is the sort of treatment you get for telling the truth. As we get closer to Inauguration Day, we're starting to get more of an idea of what that might actually look like. It doesn't sound like anything is set in stone yet by any means, but there are some sources that are starting to give hints at what they're thinking. First off, like I think we all could have guessed, a source says that they're considering a COVID test for anyone on the platform in front of the Capitol, where Joe and Kamala will be sworn in. That VIP platform usually holds 1,600 people, but there will probably be far fewer this time around. One thing that could help cut down on the number of people is the fact that congressional planners have already invited lawmakers to record video messages for the president-elect and vice president-elect that can be played on the jumbotrons before the swearing in. No decisions have been made on whether the official inaugural balls are going to still go on like usual, I'm not exactly sure if those are super necessary and worth jeopardizing the 78-year-old president's life for. That's just me. Some advocacy groups are already going virtual with their galas. One group, the Human Rights Campaign, said, quote, "Our goal is to democratize the inauguration party experience by holding a virtual event, integrating our 3 million plus members and supporters into the day's events and breaking the traditional bubble of a Washington insider experience," end quote. Which could actually be pretty cool and give a sneak peek to a lot of us who might not get the chance to ever go out there for this. There haven't been any updates on what celebrities will be performing, if they do at all, but one source close to the inauguration suggested looking for hints in the lineup of celebrities who campaigned for Biden, including Lady Gaga, John Legend, and John Bon Jovi. You can also plan on seeing some protests during the course of the day. The Answer Coalition is planning a demonstration demanding, quote, "urgent action to save the environment, end war, and prioritize money to meet people's needs," end quote. The group Let America Hear Us Roar for Trump is seeking a permit to, quote, "support our president." Boy, I'm glad the Trump group chose a name that just rolls off the tongue. By the way, we know this because they have to apply for permits to protest in these parks. As for whether Trump himself will actually show up, Biden said, quote, "It is totally his decision, and it's of no personal consequence to me, but I do think it is for the country," end quote. Personally, I think there's about a 0% chance that Trump actually shows up that day, especially if he can hold a rally, but we'll talk about that in just a bit. Overall, I think we can expect Biden to trust the medical advice available, and that he'll choose the safest option. That was the theme of his campaign. Shifting to a lot of new COVID news, ahead of Thursday's meeting about whether to officially approve the vaccine, the FDA released data confirming Pfizer's vaccine efficacy, or effectiveness, against COVID-19. The document goes on to detail the safety profile of the vaccine as favorable, and notes that the most common adverse effects to the vaccine have been reactions at the injection site, fatigue, headache, muscle pain, chills, joint pain, and fever. But that's kind of most vaccines, I feel like, at least for the flu vaccine. The document also gives a little information about what happens to you between the first and second dose, and it says that the effectiveness between the first and second dose is about 52%. But they say that, quote, "the efficacy observed after dose 1 and before dose 2 from a post hoc analysis," oh man, if we're using terms like that, I have to go get an extra pocket protector, hold on one sec. "From a post hoc analysis, cannot support a conclusion on the efficacy of a single dose of the vaccine because the time of observation is limited by the fact that most of the participants received a second dose after 3 weeks," end quote. That basically means that they don't have enough data to definitively say how protected you are between the first and second doses. That did answer one of my questions, though, because I was wondering how long there is between the doses. I'm glad it's not like a shingles vaccine or something where it's just months in between. Overall, the FDA news makes it pretty clear that we should expect them to approve this Pfizer vaccine on Thursday. Sticking with vaccine side effects, there was some pretty wild news about the AstraZeneca vaccine. In that trial, it was mostly good, they're saying it's safe, but there were 3 events classified as possibly related to the vaccine. Those included a case of hemolytic anemia, which is when destruction of red blood cells outpaces your bone marrow's production of these cells, transverse myelitis, which is when the messages that the spinal cord nerves send throughout the body get interrupted, which can cause pain, muscle weakness, paralysis, sensory problems, or bladder and bowel dysfunction, and the third was regular high fever. Besides those nasty side effects, the other insane part of this study found that there were 4 deaths during the course of the trials, but all were unrelated to the vaccine. Check this out, they were caused by a road traffic accident, blunt force trauma, homicide, and fungal pneumonia. Like, what the hell's going on over there? Some really fantastic news, though, is that early this morning for us here in the US at least, the United Kingdom began administering the first doses of the Pfizer vaccine outside of the clinical trials. Margaret Maggie Keenan, who turns 91 next week, became the first person in the world to receive an authorized, fully vetted coronavirus vaccine. And listen to this, an 81-year-old man named William Shakespeare was the second person to get the Pfizer vaccine. I'm not even kidding. The UK is a wild place, man. There was also this news, well, this isn't good news by the way, that Trump administration officials gave up a chance to purchase more than the 100 million doses of Pfizer's vaccine that it agreed to earlier this summer. The administration says the decision was made as part of a plan to diversify the nation's vaccine arsenal, and an anonymous official said that the members of the administration's Operation Warp Speed effort to mass produce a coronavirus vaccine were not trying to put all their eggs in one basket. I guess it kind of makes sense because hindsight's 2020. We didn't know that this Pfizer one was going to be so good. But of course, that has led to concerns that the company would be unable to fulfill any additional US order until June because of their commitments to other countries, which would really suck if these other vaccines don't end up being as good. Hopefully these manufacturers are able to ramp up their production quickly and that all of us can get our vaccines early.
Never gonna be president now. Never gonna be president now. One less thing to worry about. That's one less thing to worry about.
The who? The her. Loser.
Going back to the plans for Inauguration Day, people familiar with the discussions told NBC News that Trump plans to skip the ceremony in D.C., and that he has floated the idea of a Florida rally to announce that he's running again in 2024, which would honestly just be an attempt to keep himself relevant and make more money off of these people that keep donating to stop the Democrats from stealing the election. Since we all know how much Trump loves polls, I was pretty happy to see that in a new Gallup poll, Biden has a 55% favorable rating and 41% unfavorable, which is kind of strange. But the same poll gives Trump a 42% favorable rating and 57% unfavorable. Pretty much all of the polls throughout Trump's entire presidency have shown that his favorable rating has usually been in the 30s or 40s. Biden's current rating is the highest it has been since February 2019, which was 2 months before he declared his candidacy for president. In general, it seems like a lot of the talk shows that I listen in on are still saying how crazy things are and how all of this news from Trump world is substantial, but I just don't get it. Maybe I'm in the minority here, but it seems like all of the print media, like the Associated Press, New York Times, etc., always say how his claims of fraud are fake and basically that he's delusional before they even start talking about the latest thing he said or did. Everyone else around the world is watching him like they watch someone having an episode of dementia. Because that's basically what it is. The man is a sociopath whose brain cannot physically, chemically process the idea that he's a loser. But he is.
The who? The her. Loser.
Well, that's it for today, ladies and gents. Again, I just want to remind everyone that I may or may not be releasing an episode tomorrow. I'm still not sure if I'll be skipping tomorrow or Thursday, but just remember not to be too surprised if you don't see anything out there. I also just want to point out something you might have been noticing in the episode descriptions lately. Usually sometime after the episode is published, I'll add basically my whole script in there. Apparently it's supposed to help get your content found on Google and stuff like that if you make your transcripts into blog posts. So I decided to go ahead and do that since I'm always trying to get more listeners. It's also supposed to help the deaf, hard of hearing, listening impaired, and language learning audiences follow along. And I really hope it does. In any case, just know that it's usually there, and that it might not match the actual podcast audio 100%. Sometimes I recognize a typo that I just mentally correct as I'm recording, or maybe I'll think of something else I want to say on the topic, so that stuff won't typically make it in there. I will say it's a good idea to check out my sources. There were too many that I used today to name and list off on the podcast here, but go check out the transcript for those. While we're talking about growing the audience, I guess my one ask of you guys is to tell your friends about the show, introduce them to podcasts if they're not too familiar, just anything. This is supposed to be news for anyone who cares about actual facts and also doesn't want to sit through all of the pointless stories that are usually shown on the evening news. So hopefully you can tell a friend or three and get them hooked as well. Alright folks, that's the lay of the land. Stay safe, and I'll see you on the next episode. Today is Wednesday, December 9th. Hey, I'm here. Yes, I figured I'd do the show today and then just kind of skip it tomorrow, so that's what we're going to do. As for today's show, we have a lot of follow-up stories from yesterday and days previously, including Biden administration news, Chris Krebs makes another appearance. He's the former leader of the cybersecurity portion of the, Homeland Security. And some Supreme Court news that's not as big of a news story as they're making it out to seem, just in my opinion. But hey, we'll go over it anyway, and you can see what you think. Let's not waste one more second. Let's get caught up. We'll start with Joe Biden making some more cabinet appointments. First off, he did name retired Army General Lloyd Austin as his nominee for the Secretary of Defense role, which is kind of a surprise from what I was thinking. If you'll remember back to a couple of weeks ago when I first started talking about this, I said it was looking like it was Michelle Flournoy who would have been the first woman to lead the Defense Department. However, this will still be a historic pick, and historic. That always tripped me up. That's another one of my pet peeves there, but a story for another time. Anyways, Austin would be the first black Secretary of Defense if he gets confirmed by the Senate. About his new nominee, Biden had this to say, quote, "In his more than 40 years in the United States Army, Austin met every challenge with extraordinary skill and profound personal decency. He is a true and tested soldier and leader. I've spent countless hours with him in the field and in the White House Situation Room. I've sought his advice, seen his command, and admired his calm and his character. He is the definition of a patriot." End quote. So some pretty high praise there from Biden. He's expected to announce him today, so I'm not sure when this episode is going to end up coming out, but maybe you'll already have seen him speaking a little bit. Surprisingly, there's a little bit of controversy, not from Republicans, but from Democrats. So I didn't know that this was a rule, but the defense secretary position is technically supposed to be just a regular civilian leading the armed forces, which, if you think about it, that's kind of the opposite of what we're going for, right? Maybe there's a better reason for it, but it just feels like it's like putting Trump in charge of the COVID response instead of Dr. Fauci. What kind of sense does that make? But Austin has only been retired for 4 years, not 7, so he would need that congressional waiver to serve in this position. This waiver has only been granted twice in the past 70 years, most recently to Trump Defense Secretary James Mattis. And Democrats were leery of doing that then because it just broke that precedent of having the civilian in charge. But, I don't know. I don't get that. This story's from CNN, and they're making it sound like Democrats might push back a little bit on this and Biden will have to convince them, but I think it's just going to be hard to turn this guy down. 4 years seems like enough time for me to be back to a civilian, but would the soldier ever come out of this guy? Or anyone else nominated for the role who used to be military? 7 years or 50 years, I feel like a soldier is a soldier. We'll have to see how that plays out, but from what Biden is saying about him, I'm feeling pretty good about the pick. Flipping over to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which whack job Dr. Ben Carson is currently leading, Biden has selected Representative Marcia Fudge as his nominee. She had been lobbying to be the first black female agriculture secretary, but the rumor is that Biden is planning on choosing former Obama Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack. So here she is. This is kind of interesting because as early, or as recent as last month, Fudge had an interview with Politico where she said, quote, "As this country becomes more and more diverse, we're going to have to stop looking at only certain agencies as those that people like me fit in. You know, it's always like, we want to put the black person in labor or HUD." I'm not exactly sure what changed in that time period, and maybe that's just taken out of context because this was another Politico article, which you have to watch out for because they love linking to other articles on their site just to keep you hooked. But I suppose you never actually know how you're going to react until you get that call. Like if the president asks you to do something to serve, I think you just take it, you know? I don't think you get too picky. She will have an important job since a lot of folks are going to be facing eviction and back rent bills, as well as the existing homelessness problems. She will also be reinstating the rule from the Obama era that aims to help fair housing. That rule required local governments to track patterns of segregation with a checklist of 92 questions in order to gain access to federal housing funds. Lastly, she'll be stopping a Ben Carson rule that required plaintiffs to meet a higher threshold to prove unintentional discrimination, which is known as disparate impact, and gave defendants more leeway to rebut the claims. So basically it was just something else to make discrimination in housing easier. Honestly, the one downside to Marcia Fudge being nominated here, it's not Cory Booker. Remember how Trump was campaigning at the end and kept telling suburban women that big, scary Cory Booker was going to come in and destroy their neighborhoods? What a shame. Man, that was so racist. That was the only scary black person he could think of. Unbelievable. Sticking with Biden just a bit more, He also unveiled a 3-point plan to fight the coronavirus in his first 100 days in office. Point 1 is to get at least 100 million Americans vaccinated in that first 100 days. Point 2 is his pledge to sign a face mask mandate on his first day in office. And point 3 is getting kids back to school safely. I was actually surprised about the mask mandate because I thought he said he wasn't going to do that, but actually it seems like it's a little more targeted and specific than just saying everyone has to wear one. His mandate would require masks in places like federal buildings and on planes, trains, and buses for interstate travel. Biden also said that he would work with governors and mayors to pass masking mandates in communities across the country. In terms of getting kids back to school, which helps kids learning as well as opening up the economy since parents don't have to be at home with them, Biden says Congress will need to provide the necessary funding to protect students, educators, and staff. He also added that he would be prioritizing educators for getting the vaccine. This plan came on the same day that he announced a lot of his nominees for key public health positions. He announced that his chief medical advisor on the pandemic will be Dr. Fauci. Xavier Becerra, California's current Attorney General, will be his nominee for Secretary of Health and Human Services. I'm sure Kamala Harris had some say in that since that was her old position before becoming a California senator. Dr. Vivek Murthy, who was a U.S. Surgeon General for President Obama, will be Biden's nominee for Surgeon General. Biden transition co-chair and former Obama administration official Jeff Zients will serve as coordinator of the COVID-19 response and counselor to the president. Natalie Quillian, who is also a former Obama person, will be the deputy coordinator of the COVID response. This list goes on. Dr. Rochelle Walensky will be his CDC director. She's currently chief of infectious diseases at Massachusetts General Hospital. And finally, Dr. Marcella Nunez-Smith will serve as the chairwoman of Biden's COVID Equity Task Force. She's currently serving as co-chair of his transition team. Guys, I don't know if I like this. There are way too many qualified people on this list. I thought we were just supposed to have people who were loyal to our president, not these experts. I'm just messing with you. This is a super refreshing list of appointees and nominees. I think I'm most happy for Dr. Fauci for getting that new title there, and hopefully being treated as the expert he is, and with appreciation by the President of the United States, not having the President incite death threats against him. The one thing I will say for all my history nerds out there is that all these former Obama people coming back in, it sort of feels like when John Adams took over for George Washington. Since nobody knew how to transfer power because no leader had given up power until George Washington, and because Adams was short and uncharismatic, oh, there we go again with the bias against us short people, Adams wanted to make sure he'd win and not spook any of the important people who would endorse him, since actually at that time the public didn't vote. I mean, they really didn't vote for president, it was all the electors. They could care less about what the people wanted. As a result, he ended up keeping pretty much all of George Washington's cabinet. That would end up being a bad move for him because Alexander Hamilton had resigned towards the end of Washington's presidency, and in many ways he was more of George Washington's vice president than Adams, meaning that all of the cabinet was basically taking orders from him on the outside in the public, like he's in public life now but they're still taking orders from him, and ignoring Adams. I don't think that's going to happen to Joe by any means, but it seems a bit odd to be bringing so much of the band back together. At the same time, if you know people have done a good job in the past and that they're qualified, why not? I mentioned Chris Krebs in the beginning, so here he is. Yesterday, Krebs filed a lawsuit against the Trump campaign, attorney Joseph DeGeneva, and the cable channel Newsmax. He's seeking an injunction against ordering Newsmax to remove the DeGeneva interview from its website, as well as monetary damages for defamation. He said DeGeneva defamed him in that interview by saying that Krebs, quote, should be drawn and quartered, or, quote, shot at dawn. Because he said the election was the most secure in our history, Krebs claims that he's received death threats after this interview. Let's just clearly put in perspective why this is such a big deal. DeGeneva is a lawyer for the President of the United States. More accurately, he's a lawyer for his re-election campaign, but nonetheless, it is insane that someone that close to the president is saying people should be shot or drawn and quartered. This is why I said Biden's choices so far for nominees and appointees have been so refreshing. I wish the best to Chris Krebs in this pursuit. Another follow-up story is a callback to yesterday when we talked about Rebekah Jones and that raid on her house. According to the Tampa Bay Times, quote, Ron Filipkowski, a lifelong Republican who was appointed to the 12th Circuit Judicial Nominating Commission by DeSantis, resigned Tuesday morning after reviewing the search warrant affidavit the state used to seize computers and phones from Rebekah Jones. Okay, Dr. Seuss. He said that he resigned from this commission to bring attention to the way DeSantis has handled, quote, public access to truthful data and the raiding of a data analyst's home. Filipkowski is no joke. He's a former Marine as well as a former state and federal prosecutor. In his resignation letter, he said, quote, recent events regarding public access to truthful data on the pandemic and the specific treatment of Rebekah Jones has made the issue a legal one rather than just medical. I no longer wish to serve the government of Florida in any capacity. Also, according to a friend of his, and it's just dawning on me as you read more of this article that this friend sounds maybe like it could be Filipkowski, he privately said that he was alarmed by the raid, telling the friend, quote, what's the crime? The crime is hacking into an email server to tell people to tell the truth? That's not a horrible crime, if it's a crime at all. He compared her situation to the legal doctrine called necessity, which allows someone to break the law to prevent a more serious harm. Interestingly enough, Filipkowski also helped both the Lincoln Project and Center for American Progress Action Fund during the presidential campaign against Trump. So I guess, thank you, Ron Filipkowski.
Never gonna be president now. Never gonna be president now. One less thing to worry about. That's one less thing to worry about.
The who, the her. Loser.
I just want to briefly rant about that executive order that Trump signed yesterday because it's just total BS. Also, I just love that new transition I made, and I want to use it every opportunity I can. That executive order that Trump signed is called something super MAGA, like the America First Vaccine Priority or something like that. I'm not even exaggerating, I swear it had America First in there somewhere. He signed it because it helps Fox News pretend he's actually doing something, but the bill just prioritizes the shipment of vaccines to the US before it can go to other countries. First of all, that doesn't necessarily seem equitable or fair if we had passed on a deal this summer, no matter how much I'd rather have those vaccines. Second, you can't just sign a piece of paper and we magically get more vaccines. The company had to agree to a deal, and unless you're embracing socialism and seizing the means of production, this doesn't mean anything. Also, last time I checked, an insane amount of insane Americans are scared out of their minds when they even have to read the word socialism. This executive order is meaningless and it's not worth the paper it's printed on. It might as well have been one of those blank pieces of paper he signed his name on when he was at Walter Reed, pretending like he was a workaholic. Also, I almost forgot this, but I was talking about the overreaction to a news source or a news story. The U.S. Supreme Court decided not to hear one of Trump's election fraud lawsuits that started in Pennsylvania. I guess I wasn't too surprised because I don't think John Roberts or Gorsuch or even Kavanaugh wanted to touch this, because they know it's not even a real argument, and it wouldn't change the election. One state wouldn't change anything. At the same time, I suppose you can never underestimate how low these Republicans are willing to go. Either way, the cable news channels were freaking out about it. I swear I thought Wolf Blitzer was going to have a heart attack the way he was talking about it. They just kept playing that breaking news sound effect and graphic. I'm actually pretty sure they don't even have openings to their shows, they just play that every time. There's not like a theme or anything, it's just the breaking news theme. Again, maybe this is just a me thing, but I wish they would have chilled out a bit. Okay everyone, that's all I got for you. Once more, I decided I'll be taking tomorrow off, but expect a new episode on Friday. On these days where I'm more busy and don't necessarily have a ton of time to write a script and everything, I'm sort of toying with the idea of doing an Instagram or Facebook Live where you can chat and I'll just go over news and articles in real time, and then you guys would get to ask questions or suggest what news you want to go over. Then I'd post that as a podcast as well eventually. The only downside is that it clearly wouldn't be as organized as this, but maybe it would still help you get the news and help me save some time. We'll see how that goes. Let me know if you have strong feelings one way or another about that. You can reach out on any social media platform. I'm on those as @QuickNewsDaily, or you can email me directly at quicknewsdaily@gmail.com. In any case, that's the lay of the land. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you back here on Friday. Today is Friday, December 11th. It's good to be back again after a short one-day hiatus. Thanks for joining me back here to start the weekend, basically. We've got a couple of fun stories today, and then a more serious one that we follow up on. It's a follow-up story to another one that we did earlier in the week. But it's all big news, so let's get right into it. The big news from yesterday, that I think we all expected, was that vaccine advisors to the FDA voted to recommend the emergency use authorization for the Pfizer vaccine. I always get tripped up on that and say emergency youth, like it's the Sandlot or something and we need those kids right now, like emergency youth. Back to this though, on the panel, the vote was 17-4, and then one member abstained from voting. I thought that this was like the final say, but now the FDA has to decide whether to accept the recommendation, but it has signaled that it will issue the EUA for the vaccine. Then after that, there's still another step where the CDC Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices must meet to decide whether it recommends that the vaccine be deployed for use. Spoiler alert, yes. That group has a meeting scheduled for today and then expects to vote during a meeting scheduled for Sunday. Operation Warp Speed officials say that they will start shipping the vaccine within 24 hours of the FDA authorization. The FDA group is scheduled to meet again on December 17th, so next week already, to discuss Moderna's EUA application. This is all good news, and I think when you weigh the amount of testing that has happened with this, I think it's safe. At the same time, there is some unsettling news about a couple, allergic reactions that popped up in the UK. The UK regulators issued new advice to healthcare professionals stating that any person with a significant allergic reaction to a vaccine, medicine, or food, such as a previous history of anaphylactoid reaction, or those who have been advised to carry an adrenaline autoinjector, so EpiPen, should not receive the Pfizer vaccine. That's the guidance for the moment. The two staff members who had the reaction both carried an EpiPen and had a history of allergic reactions, and they developed symptoms of an anaphylactoid reaction after receiving the vaccine on Tuesday. So it was a delayed response. I think it was like the next day or the day after. I think the scariest wording of this advice was that it also states that vaccines should, quote, only be carried out in facilities where resuscitation measures are available. So yeah, that gives you just a ton of confidence with this. Finally, this advice recommends that people who carry an EpiPen should delay having a vaccination until the reason for the allergic reaction has been clarified. Again, I do want to be super careful with this because I think the benefits greatly outweigh the alternatives, and I don't want to start any unnecessary vaccine panic because these were just 2 people. And the study alone was 44,000, but it's definitely something for us to know. I also read that Pfizer's trial protocols said that to be in that study, you couldn't have had a history of severe allergic reaction, quote, to any component of the study intervention, end quote. So I'm guessing that probably means like latex, stuff like that. So that might explain why none of these reactions happened in the trial. Another expert in this CNN article said that until we know what part of the vaccine actually caused these reactions, the general public shouldn't be worried. Which makes sense. Maybe it was something that was very rare, some super niche allergic reaction. It's just something to keep in mind though as we get closer and closer to this here in the States. Some other news that I was happy to hear is that both the government and regulators want Facebook to be broken up because they're a monopoly, or at least have monopolistic tendencies. The director of the FTC's Bureau of Competition, Ian Connor, said, quote, Facebook's actions to entrench and maintain its monopoly deny consumers the benefits of competition. Our aim is to roll back Facebook's anti-competitive conduct and restore competition so that innovation and free competition can thrive. End quote. The government and regulators are saying that Facebook should have to sell off Instagram and WhatsApp. Facebook's latest argument is that people choose its services not because they have to, but because they want to, which is pretty much just a flat-out lie. I wouldn't be on there for this show unless it was absolutely necessary to build a community. For millions of small businesses, Facebook advertising is pretty much their main marketing strategy. You can't go over to Twitter and get the same visibility. Facebook's latest PR narrative is that they welcome regulation, but that cracking down too hard could risk giving other countries like China a competitive edge in the fast-moving technology sector. Well, I, for one, am glad that years and years of having to defend themselves for being a monopoly let them try out a bunch of defenses, and good for them for settling on this one that sounds like it hints at racism. I don't think it's a coincidence that Trump brainwashed his followers into thinking that Biden loves China and calls the coronavirus the China plague and all that. And then suddenly, Facebook uses this to defend itself when they know full well that they survive by letting these white supremacist, right-wing groups thrive on their platform? Not a coincidence. This whole lawsuit got started when New York Attorney General Letitia James announced in September 2019 that she was leading an investigation into Facebook for anti-competitive practices, which 47 state attorneys general signed on a month later. That's impressive. That's like the US, the entire US. These types of lawsuits understandably usually take a lot of time to play out. One of the most high-profile cases, a landmark lawsuit against Microsoft in 1998, took almost 2 years to come to a conclusion. But actually that seems pretty quick to me. When you take on a huge company who likes money and doesn't like you stepping on their toes, 2 years doesn't seem so bad. I guess we should just temper our expectations a bit, but the fact that this happened while Trump is in office is encouraging, because it's usually Republicans who are all for business rights and that sort of thing. You know, the crooked capitalism that's more of an oligopoly. In our third update of the week on this particular story, 2 videos of the raid on Rebekah Jones's house were released by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. The videos show that Jones didn't exit her home until about 23 minutes after the officers first rang the doorbell, and 15 minutes after they announced themselves as police. Also, what's up with that 8 minutes? Jones has claimed authorities waited 13 minutes while she got dressed. The officers can be heard yelling, "Police search warrant, open the door," as well as, "Make sure the whole block hears us," is what one of the officers tells the guy who's yelling. Which is kind of like, aw man, they needed to support each other. Like they needed to give each other encouragement to yell. Jones has said that the officers in the house pointed guns at her 2 and 11-year-old children and her husband, which the department has denied. She released her own video of the raid showing officers inside with the guns drawn, but this story says that it's unclear that those officers were also wearing body cameras, so they're not sure. I'm just gonna go out on a limb here and spoil the ending for you. Like, I don't know this, but I think we all know how these stories go. They're gonna find out that these super reliable body cameras mysteriously turned off on their own, or malfunctioned or something, but just on the officers that went inside the home and allegedly pointed the guns at the kids. Not the ones outside showing them doing the right thing. Just on the ones where the actual controversy is. The authorities also said that they seized 3 computers, 2 phones, and several memory cards and thumb drives. I hate to say I told you so, but I was kind of right. She wasn't totally honest, particularly on the opening the door thing, but that was about it. There's also some crazy stuff in her past, with getting arrested 3 times in relation to an affair she was having where she was like stalking the guy. It's all true, it's in court documents that she filed, which is pretty wild. Like 342 pages she wrote about it, so it was like a whole novel. So yeah, maybe she's not the perfect messenger, but there is some controversy over the actual affidavit that they used to get the search warrant. Essentially, the FDLE claims that they traced through the use of investigative resources the IP address, and there's a lot of technical stuff in this article. I highly recommend you read it because they actually do a pretty good job of breaking it down. But essentially, this use of an IP address, it's not really a great basis. It's really easy to spoof or, like, impersonate their IP address. One person here says that the cops treat it like it's a fingerprint, but it's not anywhere close to that. One expert here said it's like saying, "I found a bullet, and through investigative resources, Jason shot it." Like you just kind of yada yada yada, they're guilty. The other fishy thing is that this emergency system that she supposedly hacked into relies on a shared username and password. That's like rule number 1 that you get taught about the internet. Never share your password, and then rule number 2 is like, don't make your password password. It was also revealed Wednesday that the username and password for this system are on a document that was publicly available on the Department of Health site. Publicly available, just on their website. That's wild. How can you say it was her when it's just out there for everyone? That's insane. One of the other experts in this article says that it's weird that the only things I think that you would have had probable cause to seize would be the router and the computers, as well as the modem. But her router and modem weren't seized. So basically the consensus here is that this was to get her information, her data, her hard drives and stuff that would reveal her sources, the people in the government who are still leaking to her, who are letting her update this website. That's what this was really about. It's not about a message on a system that could be accessed by theoretically anyone, since it's just out there on that document. This just reeks of being a political attack, just a purely political revenge attack. But I'll tell you one thing, I will keep updating you on this. I'll keep a close eye on this. I'm guessing we'll be having a lot of information come out about this over the next couple of weeks. Also, like I briefly mentioned, for this info today, it was from a great story in the Florida Today newspaper, which is like the Florida division of USA Today. So go check that out and give them some traffic. This article was fantastic. Ooh, rhyming. The link is in the sources, which is in the episode description for today. Alright, I think that's where I'm going to cut it off for today. I had something... Oh yeah, the only other thing was that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were named Time Magazine's Person of the Year, like their co-Person of the Year, People of the Year, if you will. So that was pretty cool. It must have drove Donald Trump crazy. But in any case, I don't think I have anything for quick news right now. So, if you could, just share the show with a friend or three and get them hooked, and that's the lay of the land for today. Stay safe, and I'll see you on Monday.